We're going to start off this chapter on deform modifiers with the lattice modifier. Now, a lattice is something you can use to deform meshes. Let's open up Modifiers, Lattice in the Projects Blends folder. And you'll see a cheesy little spaceship that I made. What we want to do is make a little warp speed animation where the spaceship stretches out as it approaches a wormhole. For that, we'll use a lattice to define how and where the spaceship will begin to warp. So let's create a lattice in top view. Press Shift and A and add a lattice. Let's move it over to the right. You'll see what appears to be just a regular cube. But this is really a cage, and anything that passes through it will be distorted depending on how we shape this. I'm going to scale this up so that it's bigger than the spaceship. And right now, since we didn't really deform this cage, if we move the spaceship through it, nothing happens. But once we deform the cage, anything that passes through it will be deformed by it as well, to the same degree that the cage is deformed. Now, before the spaceship can actually be affected by the lattice, we need to add a lattice modifier. So select the spaceship and go into the modifiers buttons, which is the little wrench icon, and add, under the deform column, the lattice modifier. And for the target object, select the lattice that we just created. Now move the spaceship through it, and nothing happens yet still because we didn't do anything to the lattice. So select the lattice, go into edit mode by pressing the tab key, and let's select the vertices on the back end here and just stretch them all the way over. Just like that. And tab out and select the spaceship again, and now move it into the lattice, and you see it stretches out like it's going to warp speed. Now let's go back into edit mode of the lattice, and let's say we scale this one end down, really small like that. Let's see what happens then. It kind of shrinks down, and it comes out the other side stretched and smaller. Now select the lattice, and let's add a little bit more detail so we have more to play with. Go to the lattice buttons, which is this little grid icon in the properties window. And here, these three fields change the resolution. So if we crank them all up to, say, 4, you'll see it kind of subdivides it everywhere. And now we have more to play with. So let's select the middle vertices here and shrink them down. Maybe make these bigger. Let's see how this looks. Pretty cool, huh? Now make a note that the more detail your mesh has, the better the stretching will be. After I created this spaceship, I subdivided a couple times so that there was more geometry to stretch through and everything would look smoother. Now let's open up a different blend file. So go back in the same folder and open up Modifiers, Lattice, Tire. You can use a lattice to shape objects without actually modifying the mesh itself. One of the best examples I've seen using lattices is using them with car tires. And because it's so cool, I need to steal the idea and show you how to do it. Because of the weight of the car resting on tires, the bottoms of the tires are usually more compressed and they protrude outward. If we modified the actual tire mesh itself, then we couldn't rotate the tire. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to select the tire mesh, and in side view, I'm going to select these bottom vertices here, press the O key for proportional vertex editing, and just stretch them out like that. So that's generally the effect we're trying to get here by the weight of the car compressing the bottom of the tire like that. This is a bit extreme, just for illustration. But if I actually modify the mesh itself like that, when I go to rotate the wheel, that bump's going to go with it, and that's not what I want at all. I want that bump to stay at the bottom of the tire no matter how the tire itself rotates. That's what we use lattices for. So I'm going to press Ctrl and Z to undo all that, get my regular tire back, and now let's create a lattice. I'm going to go in top view, press Shift and A, and add a lattice again. I'm going to scale that up to the size of the tire. And I'm going to center it with the tire. And in side view, I'm going to scale it on the y-axis so that it's squished a bit. Just like that. Note that changing the lattice in object mode will not deform it. Only changing it in edit mode will deform the mesh. Let's select the tire, and let's add a lattice modifier so that it's affected by this lattice. Let's do it the same way we did with the spaceship. Go to the modifier buttons, and add the lattice modifier. And for the target object, choose the lattice we just created. Now if we go into edit mode of the lattice, and start moving things around, you'll see now our tire is affected by the lattice. Now the only thing left to do is add some more resolution to the lattice and then just modify the bottom of it so that the tire bumps out a little bit. So let's do that by selecting the lattice, going into the lattice options, and changing the resolution. I'm going to change U to 5 and W to 7. There we go. Now let's go in side view. Press tab to go into edit mode. Select the bottom vertices there and just stretch them on the y-axis just like that. Perfect. Now in front view, I'm going to flatten this out a little bit just by selecting these vertices and moving them straight up. Perfect. I'm going to press H to hide that so we can just see the tire. And there we go. I'm going to select the hub, press R and then Y to rotate it on just the y-axis. And you'll see as I'm rotating the wheel, no matter what part of the tire is at the bottom, it's going to be affected by that bump in the lattice. So as we spin the tire around, the bottom of it will always look the same because of the lattice. So just sit back and admire the coolness. Just a quick note, I parented the tire to the hub, so however I rotate the hub, the tire is going to rotate with it. That's why I selected the hub to rotate everything. I didn't want the hub to be affected by the lattice because this is steel, this isn't going to bend. So only the rubber of the tire is affected by the lattice. And the tire is parented to the hub, which I can rotate on the y-axis to spin it around. And that's one of the best uses for lattices I've seen. It's one of the most logical uses for lattices I've seen. It's very cool. Now we're going to move on to the shrink wrap modifier. And that does pretty much exactly what it sounds like it does. It's like taking cellophane wrapping and just, putting it over something. Let me open up an example file. So go to the Project Blends folder and open up Modifiers Shrink Wrap. So here I have two examples. Probably the best use of this tool is to put clothing on characters. Like here we have this balloon shirt that I just quickly made over this human character. And I'm going to use the shrink wrap modifier to shrink that down around his body so that it's form-fitting. And the next example I have is this mesh text right here. I want to take this text and I want to project it backward onto this sphere so that it wraps around the sphere. And I'm going to do that using the same modifier, but just with some different settings. So let's go back to our guy in the blue shirt. I'm going to select the shirt, and I'm going to add a shrink wrap modifier. Now nothing happens yet because we still have to define the target object, the object that it fits over. And that object's name is body2. So select the shirt again, go back into the shrink wrap modifier, and change the target to body2. There we go. You'll see it worked, but it's kind of intersecting everywhere. We can fix that by changing the offset. So let's just increase that to 0.15. So the shrink wrap modifier just made this bubbly shirt form-fitting around this character. And that's one of the best uses for this modifier. Alright, now that we've quickly added some clothing to our character, let's move on to the second example, the sphere text. I'm going to select this text, and this is a mesh object. You can see in edit mode it has all those vertices. And we're going to use the shrink wrap modifier and just project this backwards onto the sphere. So the sphere's object name is called sphere. So let's select the sphere text and add the shrink wrap modifier to it. Let's change target to sphere. And you'll see right off the bat it sort of kind of works, but it distorts the text. That's because it's doing the typical shrink wrap transformation and just kind of like squishing it back onto the object behind it. What we want to do is just literally project it backwards on one axis, on the y-axis. So it doesn't distort the text, but it does wrap it around the sphere. We can do that by changing the mode from nearest surface point to project. And nothing happens because we have to choose an axis. So let's try to choose the y-axis. And that worked perfectly. It's intersecting a little bit, so again, let's just increase the offset a tiny bit. Whoops, got to decrease it actually. To negative 0.05. There we go. So in front view, it actually looks exactly the same. We can make this invisible, and you'll see that there's really no squishing happening. It's just projecting it backward onto the sphere. So just to recap that, add the shrink wrap modifier, change the mode from nearest surface point to project, and enable the y-axis so that it projects backward on the y-axis. Now you might need to play with some of these settings. If that doesn't give you exactly what you're looking for, you might need to change the axis, or you might need to change the direction from positive to negative, or both. But just play with the settings and you're guaranteed to get something that you're looking for. In this case, we're projecting it back on the y-axis with positive value enabled. And I changed the offset a little bit so that it wasn't intersecting. And that's basically what the shrink wrap modifier does. You can use it for clothing, or you can use it to project objects or designs onto curvy surfaces and things like that. Now let's move on to the simple deform modifier. This modifier is just going to give us a couple of cool options we can use to distort our mesh. So I'm going to work with the default cube here. I'm going to go into edit mode, select everything, and subdivide it 3 times, just for some more detail to work with. And back in object mode, I'm going to go to the modifiers buttons and add in that simple deform modifier. You'll see right off the bat it begins kind of twisting around, like the top part of the cube is taken and just rotated around. This is the default twist option, and we can make that more or less extreme by changing the angle of deform. Now let's choose the bend option, and this will kind of bend it around. Tapering will make pyramids out of it, and stretching it will squish it and stretch it out. Boing, boing. Now one thing to note is that all of this is relative to the location of the origin point. So it's twisting, bending, tapering, and stretching based on the location of that origin. For example, if I go into top mode and move all those vertices up, away from the origin point, you'll see the effect kind of changes now. Now when you increase or decrease the stretch factor, it's going to be pulling and pushing towards and away from the origin. And same thing with tapering and bending. Bending most notably because Now that we moved it away from the origin point, we can actually bend this sucker around in a full circle if we want to, because it's bending around that origin point. And twisting. So make a note when you're using this modifier that the origin point, its location relative to the mesh itself, is very important. That's all there is to this modifier. Now we're going to move on and create a little cool animation using the wave modifier. Using the wave modifier, we're going to create a little animation of a raindrop falling into a pond and creating ripples. To do that, first let's start by creating the pond. So let's delete this default cube and add a plane from top view. And in edit mode, I'm going to scale that up real big and subdivide it 4 or 5 times. I'm going to move it up on the z-axis just a little so that it's away from that grid. Alright, now let's create our ripples using the wave modifier. So go to the modifier buttons and add a wave modifier. Now it starts to bump out, you'll see. So we can play through the animation and see how it looks like by default by pressing Alt and A. Pretty good so far, but you can see it just continues going on forever and ever. So let me explain to you what some of these settings do here. First off, we have our motion. If you choose to keep X and Y enabled, you'll have this round ripple effect. If you deselect one of them, then you're going to have more of a horizontal wave going on. Now the offset value here under time tells the waves when to start. So let's increase that to frame 20 to give us some time to have the raindrop falling. Now you'll see the wave disappears because we're at frame 1 right now. And you can see the current frame in this field down here in the timeline. So press Alt and A now, and you'll see there's a bit of a delay before the waves start. Now let's change the lifetime of the wave from 0, which is infinite, which means the waves will just keep going on and on and on. Let's change life from 0 to 20. So as soon as the ripple starts, after 20 frames, it'll start to die down. So let's see how that looks. Press Alt and A over the 3D view. And there we go. I think it dies out a little bit too soon. We can change either the lifetime of the wave, or we can have it die down slower by changing the damping. So if we change the damp value from 10 to 100, the waves will start gradually getting smaller and smaller and smaller until they disappear altogether. So let's see how that looks. You'll see the waves are now diminishing at a much slower rate, and that looks a whole lot better. So that basically takes care of the wave that we wanted to create. Now real quick, let's just go ahead to frame 20 when the waves start by clicking on that field in the timeline and typing in 20. You can also use the left key and the right key, or the left and right arrow keys, to scroll through the frames. So at frame 20 there, we see the wave is bumping up. It's not exactly what we want. Since the raindrop is falling into it, we want that to be going down first. So let's change height from 0.5 to negative 0.5. There we go. Now there's a bit of a depression from when the raindrop first impacts the water. So let's see how that looks. Let's go back to frame 1 by typing number 1 into that field. Press Alt and A. Let's see how it looks. That's better. Press Escape to stop the animation. And I'm going to go to frame 50. So here we get a good visual of what the waves look like. And I'm going to move that above the grid since it's intersecting. I don't really like how it looks, so let's change that up a little bit. Let's change the narrow value here and make the top of the waves a little bit sharper. So I'm going to change the narrow value from 1.5 to 1. Much better. So narrow is how sharp the crest of the wave is. The width of the wave is, you'll see, how long the wave is itself. So you can play with that value too, but I'm going to leave that at 1.5. Speed is how fast the ripples will go. You can play with that setting if you don't have something perfect. And the height is how high or low the waves are. So now that we have our wave in place, let's work on the raindrop. Let's go back to frame 1 and press Shift and A and add a UV sphere. And inside view, let's move that up. And in edit mode, let's scale it down real small. Stretch it up like this. And let's just make a little bit of a raindrop shape. By scaling in all these circles. Alright, there's our stupid little raindrop. Alright, I'm going to move that up a little bit higher. And make sure we're back on frame 1 here. Now we're going to make an animation of this dropping down into the pond. So at frame 1, with the raindrop selected, press the I key to insert keyframes for an animation, and choose the option Location. That inserts that object's location at that frame that we're on. So once you select that, at frame 1, that object's location is recorded right where it is right now. So let's move ahead to frame 15. That's where we get the first visible sign of the wave starting. So with the raindrop selected, press G and then Z to move it straight down on the Z axis, right through the water, leaving a bit of space there between the raindrop and the plane. So with that move down there, and on frame 15, press the I key again and insert another location keyframe. Now if you press the left key, or the left arrow, you'll see as the frames go back down to frame number 1, the raindrop returns to its position at frame 1. And as you advance down to frame 15, the raindrop goes down to that position. And then we see the waves being created by the raindrop falling. So go back to frame 1, press Alt and A. Let's see how it looks. That looks pretty cool. I think the waves could be faster, but you get the idea. So to recap, to animate this raindrop, at frame 1, press the I key, insert its location, and then go to frame 15, which is when the waves on the plane just start to break, or just start to appear. Move the raindrop down there below the plane, press I again, and insert another location keyframe. And that makes our object animated. And that does it for this chapter. That's how to use a wave modifier, and that is a bit of an introduction to object animation.